Good morning. As I see it, the world is racing towards the abyss. In our quest to improve material standards, we are moving full speed towards irreversible climate change, biodiversity loss, and removal of natural beauty. At the same time, we allow inequity to rise, guaranteeing us future social tension and conflict. The tragedy is that we let this happen, even though it is fully possible to stop the race, if we just decided to do so. University research can contribute to a solution to a less unsustainable world. In principle, most people agree on the long-term goal, which is to increase the well-being of the majority. Not only to increase the GDP, but to ensure that ordinary citizens get as higher disposable income, has access to sufficient public services, education, health, safety, can live in a pollution-free environment, and look to the future believing that the situation will be sustainable. That is, however, not the picture I see when I look to the future. The most likely future as I see it is illustrated by this graph. It is one where human activity, population and physical production, continues to rise, leading to an increasing human footprint, resource use and pollution output. The rising footprint leads to rising environmental damage, global warming, destruction of nature, which in turn leads to reduced well-being, unstable weather, ever more scary forest fires, hurricanes, floods and droughts, high costs of reconstruction, less access to natural beauty. The loss of environmental services and quality will trump the continuing rise in material consumption, for example, through unavoidable spending to reduce pollution damage, replace cheap access to foreign resources, and to stop migration. Luckily, it is fully possible, I believe, to stop these negative developments and to move the world towards a sustainable situation where most of the UN Sustainable Development Goals are actually achieved. And I believe this can be done in 50 years. The solution is described in our report, Transformation is Feasible, that came a year ago. In this report, we study different pathways into the future for a world split into 6 regions and operating on our finite planet, that is, within the existing planetary boundaries. Our ambition was to answer the question, how can humanity achieve the 17 Sustainable Development Goals within the 9 planetary boundaries? In our base scenario, in what we see as the most likely future, many of the Sustainable Development Goals will not be achieved by 2030 and not even by 2050. In our other scenarios, we study possible global action that could lead to achievement of more SDGs, like more money, faster growth, better organization, and so on. The sad fact is that neither of these conventional responses achieves the goal. Conventional policy response will not lead to the achievement of all 17 SDGs within the 9 planetary boundaries by 2050. The good news is that our study indicates that there does indeed exist a set of 5 actions, a set of 5 measures that will indeed achieve the SDGs on our finite planet and in time. The bad news is that they are truly extraordinary and truly hard to sell, both in the rich and the poor world. The 5 measures are shown on this slide. 1, phase out all use of fossil fuels, coal, oil and gas, in order to stop climate change. 2, make agriculture and forestry sustainable in order to stop the loss of biodiversity. 3, reduce the population through free education, health and contraception in order to limit the human footprint, particularly that in the future. 4, make the richest pay the transition cost. In order to make the transition politically feasible, it has to be paid for. And 5, use new development models, like for instance the Chinese or the Costa Rican, in order to eradicate poverty in poor areas. These 5 measures are all technically feasible. We already know what needs to be done and we know how to do it, but they are not very popular, to say the least. Consequently, they are hard to implement in democratic society, especially for 2 reasons. First, the 5 measures cost more in the short term than continuing business as usual. For example, electric cars are more expensive than fossil cars and need subsidies to advance. Second, the 5 measures lead to loss of jobs when dirty activity is replaced with green activity. For example, when we shift from building and operating coal-fired utilities to building and operating solar power farms. My conclusion is that the free market will not choose to invest heavily in the 5 measures if left to itself, and that the incumbent workers and owners of the dirty sector will oppose a rapid green shift. This double resistance makes it very difficult to get broad agreement on strong actions to save the world, unless we are willing to use unconventional solutions, in this case collective action or a strong state. For as I see it, it is fully possible for the state to reduce the double resistance. First, the state can reduce the problem of high cost of green solutions by banning the dirty activity or subsidizing green activity. Second, the state can reduce the problem of job loss by paying the income of workers who lose their dirty job until they have found a new one in the green sector. Luckily, there are signs that progressive states are moving in this direction, but sadly much too slow to avoid a decline in average human well-being before the situation gets better in the middle of the century. But of more relevance to you is the question, what can universities do to help solve the problem? What can universities do to help global society implement my 5 measures? The main answer is, do research on solutions, not on the problems. We already know very well what is the problem: impending climate change, growing inequity, declining biodiversity, melting glaciers, plastics in the ocean, and so on and so on. What we do not know is how to get the 5 measures implemented. This is where universities should help. And this is where they really can help, both through research and through education. In order to identify useful research tasks, a useful starting point is to ask the question for the measure of interest. How can we make it simpler to implement the measure? How can we reduce the cost? How can we reduce the loss of jobs? How can we achieve agreement on unpopular measures? How can we reduce the counterforces? How can we reduce the negative impact of all the people who say that this cannot be done? How do we avoid the least common denominator effect? How do we avoid that progressive operators are kept back by competitive forces in an open economy? In my experience, the simplest way to find a good research topic is to listen to what people say when you propose something. Normally they say, this is impossible because of XXX. Your job, then obviously, as a researcher, is to find a practical solution to that objection. For example, when I say that it is important to lower the population in the rich world, the audience normally responds that this is impossible because there will not be enough workers to take care of a rising number of old. This, of course, immediately points to an interesting research task. How big will the burden become when you remember to correct for the fact that there will be fewer young people in an old population? And second, how much must the pension age be increased to solve the problem? Where you will discover that it doesn't take very much increase in the pension age to solve the problem. So Facing our 5 measures, there are numerous tasks, both in the social and natural sciences. Many of them need a systems perspective, which plays well into the current ideal among research funders, which is cross-sectoral cooperation and huge research consortia. Since time permits, let me give you a few other examples of interesting research topics. In energy, study how much it will actually cost to shift the global economy from fossil fuels to renewable electricity and green hydrogen. I can tell you the answer is about 1% of the world GDP, or in other words, we need to shift 1% of the labor force and 1% of the machinery, the capital of the world, from dirty to clean activity. Not very much. In land use, study how much more food will be grown in the world if the fertilizer that we currently use in the rich world is shipped to the poor world and applied to their soils. Or study how much water can be saved by shifting production to the most suitable places on the planet, and identify the changes in trade agreements that are necessary to do such shifts. In income distribution, study how much you must increase the income tax of the world's richest 10% in order to pay the full cost of the transition to a sustainable world. Again, I can give you the answer, is that you need to increase their income tax by roughly 1 percentage point. You could then next study how one could achieve a democratic majority for such a move, where 99% of the population would be in favor, and what regulations, what legislation would have to be changed in order to have the rich pay for the obvious solution to our obvious problem. And finally, in new development models, study how China managed to 16-double its GDP per person of its 1.3 billion people in 40 years, something that has never been achieved through the application of the Washington Consensus Development Model that we in the West have been using. The list can be made very long, even if you limit yourself to finding practical solutions to short-term obstacles. So let me sum up. The main task, as I see it, for French universities is to make the political majority in the rich world understand the urgency of the current crisis. Next, to make the majority understand that solutions exist that will not sacrifice their well-being. And thirdly, that the main obstacle is to achieve a democratic majority in favor of getting the job done. In short, your task is to make France understand that collective action now will ensure higher well-being for most citizens in 2050. French universities should contribute by doing research and education that makes it simpler for the French majority to support a grand program for increased and sustainable well-being for the majority. Thank you.